Okay, so this is the last section in chapter 6, section 6.6, solving quadratic equations by factoring. So what we'll be doing is we're looking for the answer that x equals with these particular problems. So we're going to use what's called the zero product principle. And we have spent much time on learning how to factor polynomials. Now we'll look at one important use of factoring. In this section, we will use factoring to solve equations of degree 2. Up to this point, we've only looked at solving equations of degree 1. There are many different ways to solve quadratic equations of degree 2. Factoring is just one of the different ways. If you take Algebra 2, the Math 11, 20, then you will be learning to solve them by other methods. But for us, we're just going to be factoring them. So the definition of a quadratic equation in x is an equation that can be written in standard form. Notice the ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. That is the most important part, is for you to solve it, you have to make sure that it's set equal to 0. Where a and b and c are real numbers, with x cannot be 0. With a quadratic equation, an x is also called a second degree polynomial. So this is called a quadratic equation or a second degree polynomial. Okay, the zero product rule. If the product of two algebraic expressions is 0, then at least one of the factors is equal to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to set them both equal to 0, and that's going to give us our two solutions. And let me make a point. When you solve quadratic equations, you can have one solution, two solutions, or no solutions. We won't be necessarily looking at the ones for no solutions. Those are more in depth that we do in the second part of algebra. So here's our first example. Says solve this quadratic equation by the zero product principle. The only way this product can be 0 is if at least one of the factors is 0. Thus, what we're going to do is set them both equal to 0. So we're going to go x plus 5 equals 0, or 2x minus 1 equals 0. Then we're going to solve both of those equations for x. So we're going to subtract 5 from both sides. We're going to get x equals -5. And then we're going to, let's say we're going to add 1 to both sides. 2x equals 1. We're going to divide by 2. X equals 1/2. So my two solutions are -5 and 1/2. And so when you put them in my math lab, what you'll do is you'll see some parentheses, and you're just going to go -5, comma 1/2. Doesn't really matter which order you put them in. You just have to make sure that you put them inside the little quotient parentheses that they give you. Make sure that you don't put regular parentheses around them, because then it looks like an ordered pair. So you just type them in like that. Okay, so now we're going to solve this one. So again, if it's already factored, we just go ahead and we set them equal to 0 and solve. So 2x plus 1 equals 0, and x minus 4 equals 0. Subtract 1 from both sides. Divide by 2 on both sides. X equals -1/2. And so then I just add 4 to both sides. X equals 4. So my solution is -1/2, comma 4. Those are pretty darn simple. Okay, so now we're going to step it up a little bit. We're going to solve the quadratic equation by factoring. So what we're going to have to do is factor it first. So solving a quadratic equation by factoring. If necessary, rewrite the equation in standard form, moving all the terms to the side, thereby obtaining a 0. That says 0 there on the other side. Then you're going to factor. That says factor. Then you're going to apply the zero product principle, like what we just did. We're going to solve the equations. And then sometimes we need to go ahead and check them to make sure that they work back into the original. You won't find too many that won't work. Okay, so here we go. So our first one, what we have to do first is we have to set it equal to 0. So we've got to take this 8 and we've got to plug it back over there. So to get it over on the other side, we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. So we're going to have x squared minus 7x minus 8 equals 0. Now we're going to go ahead and factor it. By now we should be getting pretty good at factoring here. So x and x Signs plus and minus. Two numbers that multiply together that make 8 that has a difference of -7. So I'm going to say x equals -8, or x minus 8, and x plus 1. Now that they're factored, I set them both equal to 0 using the zero product property. And then I solve them. So I'm going to subtract 1. X equals -1. And I'm going to add 8.
I can't get the answer to that on Apple Watch.
Hit my button on Apple Watch. Sorry about that. X equals 8. So those are my two solutions for that one. Not too bad when the factoring is easy. All right, so here we go again. So we got to take the 45, stick it over there. X squared minus 4x minus 45 equals 0. We go ahead and we factor it. X and x, plus and minus. What times what makes 45? It has a difference of 4, and it's going to be -4, so we're going to need a -9 and a +5. Using our zero product property, we're going to set them equal to 0. So x plus 5 equals 0. X minus 9 equals 0. Subtract 5 from both sides. X equals -5. And add 9 to both sides, so x equals 9. So -5 and 9 is my solution. Okay, now, some people would want to take the -x squared and put it to that side, but when you set them up, a always needs to be positive. So what we have to do is we actually have to take both of these to this side. So to take a positive 10 over, we're going to have to subtract 10x. And to take a -25 over, we're going to have to add 25 to both sides. Equals 0. So then, of course, I'm going to go ahead and solve it. So x and x. It's going to be minus minus. What times what makes 25? It adds up to be 10. 5 and 5. Okay, now this is a special case because they're both the same. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say x minus 5 equals 0. No reason to write it again. And so then we write x equals 5. And in this case, you have one solution. And what these solutions are where the parabola crosses the x-axis. So in this case, I would have a parabola that's hitting at -5 and +9. So my parabola would be looking like this. But in this case, what's going on, it only hits it once, so what's happening is this parabola is sitting on the x-axis at 5. Its vertex is at 5. So that's what those solutions are representing, is where they cross the x-axis at. Okay, so now this one looks a little different. So what we're going to do, again, we're going to set it equal to 0. So we're going to bring this over here. X squared minus 4x equals 0. Now, this isn't a trinomial to factor, this is a binomial. So what I got to do is I'm going to factor out my greatest common factor, which is x. I get x minus 4 left. Divide them both by x. I'm still going to set up my equations equal to 0. So I'm going to say x equals 0 and x minus 4 equals 0. Well, this one I'm not going to I don't have to do anything more to it, so that's my answer. And then this one, my answer is x equals 4, because I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So again, this parabola is crossing at 0, and it's crossing down here at 4. So this parabola is looking like this. Not really sure off the top of my head where that vertex is, but just the meaning what those answers are. They're just where they're crossing. So 0, 4 is my solution. Okay, next one. This one gets a little more complicated. Some people just say, well, I just got to subtract 14, I'm all good to go. Excuse me. No, in fact, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to FOIL the first two together, and then set it equal to 0. So what I'm going to have to do is FOIL this, and then I have to set it equal to 0. So x times x is x squared. X times 4 is 4x. Negative 1 times x is negative 1x. Negative 1 times 4 is negative 4 equals 14. So now what I do is I go ahead and I flip this. So I'm just going to subtract 14 from here and there. Now I'm just going to combine all this together. So I'm going to have x squared. Negative 4x plus 1x is positive 3x. Negative 4 and negative 14 makes negative 18 equals 0. Now I have to factor this thing again. So I'm going to go ahead and factor it again. So here's my two parentheses, x and x, plus and minus. What makes 18? That has a difference of 3. And let's see, so that's 9 and 2, no, 6 and 3. So I'm going to have a positive 6 and a negative 3. Next step, set them equal to 0. So x plus 6 equals 0, and x minus 3 equals 0. Solve for x equals negative 6, and x equals positive 3. So my two solutions are negative 6 and positive 3. A little bit more work on that one with the factoring, or the foiling first, and then back to factoring. Okay, solving problems using the quadratic equations. So a gymnast dismounts the uneven bars at a height of 8 feet from the initial upward velocity of 8 feet per second. The function s of t equals negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 8 describes the height of the gymnast's feet above the ground. S of t in feet, so that's the feet, and t is in seconds after dismounting. The graph of the function is shown below. So here she is, she jumps off, and then she heads down. Okay, so when will the gymnast be 8 feet above the ground? Identify the solution as one or more points on the graph. So when is she going to be 8? So here's 8. So this point right here is 8. So she's going to be 8 here, and she's going to be 8 here. Well, so if I look at that graph, she's going to be 8 at time equals 0 and time equals 0.5 of a second. So I can tell that by the graph. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to solve it using algebra to see if I get the same solution. So don't mind my mess over there. So what I'm going to do is, here's the original equation. Remember, s of t is height. So that's why I put the 8 there. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it equal to 0 and factor it. So here we go. I'm going to set this, so I'm going to set this equal to 0. So what I got to do is I got to subtract 8 from both sides. So 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 8t. And then that canceled too. Okay, so now I got to factor this. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to write it the other way because it drives me nuts writing it that way. Just put the 0 on the other side. So what I'm going to do is, since it's just a binomial, I got to factor something out of it. So I'm going to factor out, I'm going to take that negative and get rid of it. And 16 and 8, I can factor an 8 out. And I'm going to factor t out. So I'm going to take out a negative 8t. So negative 16t squared divided by negative 8t is what? 2t. And then 8t divided by negative 8t is negative 1 equals 0. Set them both equal to 0. And solve for t. Oops, I meant to write that as a minus. And so I'll go back here. Minus 1 equals 0. So, of course, I would divide by negative 8. So t equals 0. And this one I would add 1 to both sides. I would divide by 2. And I get the half. So I get the same solution by looking at the graph or by solving it algebraically. Okay, so again, you can see it by the graph right there and right there. And that's the 1/2 that we got. Okay, so here's another one. The length of a rectangle sign is 3 feet longer than it is wide. So it's 3 feet longer than it is wide. If the sign area is 54, so if you remember, area is length times width when it comes to a rectangle or a square. Square feet, find its length and the width. Let x equal the width of the sign. So if I draw a picture, this is going to be the width, and since the length is 3 feet longer than the width, we're going to say that it's w plus 3. The area is 54. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply those two together, and it should equal 54. Now, when I already wrote it down here, I used x's instead of w's. It really does not matter which letter you use. So what I'm going to do is erase those. And I'm just going to put w's in. Okay, so let's go to the next page. Again, erase those and put those w's back in. Okay, so write the equation in standard form by finding the product of the right side, then subtracting 54 from both sides. So again, 54 equals, I'm going to distribute w squared plus 3w. I'm going to set it equal to 0, so I'm going to subtract 54 from both sides. 0 equals w squared plus 3w minus 54. So I set it up in standard form. My next step is going to be to factor it. So again, I use different letters, but that's all right. So w squared plus 3w minus 54 equals 0 is what we got on the other slide. So we're going to go ahead and factor it. W and w, plus and minus, what times what makes 54? That has a difference of 3. So 9 times 6 is 54. So we're going to go positive 9, negative 6. So use the zero product property. W equals negative 9. W equals positive 6. Now the question is, can you really have a negative width? So w equals negative 9 is not going to be a solution because you can't have a negative width. So it looks like my width is going to be 6. So if my width of the sign is 6, then the length is going to be 6 plus 3, or 9. So my sign is going to be 6 by 9. Okay, so that is the end of that lesson. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to text me, and good luck. And I will see you soon.